When we think of the Vikings, the image that often comes to mind is that of fierce, ruthless raiders, storming across seas to pillage, burn, and destroy. For centuries, this has been the popular image of the Viking Age, especially in relation to England. The Viking raids that began in the late 8th century and continued for over 200 years have etched the Vikings into the collective memory as pillagers, invaders, and destroyers of Anglo-Saxon England. But as with many historical events, the truth is far more complex. Were the Vikings only brutal raiders, or did they play a significant role in the development and shaping of England as we know it today? In this video, we will explore the two sides of the Viking story in England, the pillagers and the pioneers. To understand the impact of the Vikings on England, we need to go back to the very beginning, to the first recorded Viking attack in 793 AD. This was the infamous raid on the Lindisfarne Monastery, located off the northeast coast of England in what is now Northumberland. The attack shocked the Christian world. The monastery, which was one of the most sacred sites in England, was looted, its monks killed or taken as captives, and its treasures plundered. This brutal raid, along with other similar attacks over the following decades, created an image of the Vikings as savage marauders who left nothing but destruction in their wake. But the Viking raids were not just mindless acts of violence. The reasons behind the Viking invasions were multifaceted, shaped by social, economic, and political factors. Norse society was experiencing a period of population growth, and its resources were stretched thin. For many Vikings, the raids were not only a way to acquire wealth, but also a means of survival. In addition to the raids, the Vikings were also looking for new lands to settle, driven by the pressures of overpopulation and a desire for land to cultivate and establish kingdoms. As the Viking raids continued, they began to shift from mere pillaging to more organized invasions. One of the most famous Viking leaders, Ragnar Lothbrok, is said to have led several expeditions against England in the 9th century. But it wasn't until the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865 that the Vikings began to establish a lasting presence on English soil. The Great Heathen Army, led by the sons of Ragnar, invaded the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms with the intent to conquer and settle, rather than simply raid and plunder. They made their way through the kingdoms of Northumbria, Mercia, and East Anglia, overwhelming local rulers and seizing control of large swaths of territory. This marked the beginning of a new phase of Viking influence in England. Rather than simply being feared invaders, the Vikings were now conquerors and settlers, establishing their own kingdoms and governing structures. The most famous of these was the Kingdom of York, which was ruled by Viking kings for several decades, and became one of the most prosperous and influential cities in England during the Viking Age. Under Viking rule, York became a thriving center of trade and culture, with extensive connections to Scandinavia and Europe. In the centuries that followed, Viking influence in England continued to grow. The Danelaw, a region of England under Viking control, covered much of the northern and eastern parts of the country. The Danelaw was not a region of constant warfare and destruction, but rather a place where Vikings and Anglo-Saxons lived side by side, trading, farming, and forging new alliances. The Vikings brought with them their language, culture, and legal systems, which blended with those of the Anglo-Saxons, creating a unique fusion of Norse and Anglo-Saxon traditions. One of the most lasting legacies of the Vikings in England was their influence on the English language. Many English words have their roots in Old Norse, especially in the areas of law, trade, and everyday life. For example, words such as husband, sky, egg, and window all have their origins in Old Norse. The Vikings also introduced new methods of governance and justice. The Viking legal system, known as the Thing, was a form of assembly where free men could come together to settle disputes and make laws. This system influenced the development of English law, particularly in the northern regions where Viking rule was strongest. In addition to their contributions to language and law, The Vikings also brought new technologies and agricultural practices to England. They introduced new shipbuilding techniques, which allowed for faster and more efficient travel across the seas. These longships, which were light, flexible, and capable of navigating both open waters and shallow rivers, revolutionized travel and trade. The Vikings also brought advanced farming techniques, such as plowing fields using oxen and rotating crops, which improved agricultural productivity. But despite the contributions of the Vikings to the development of England, their rule was not without conflict. The relationship between the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings was often tense, with frequent clashes over land and power. The most famous of these conflicts was the Battle of Edington in 878, where King Alfred the Great of Wessex defeated the Viking leader Guthrum and secured peace for a time. However, despite these conflicts, the Vikings and Anglo-Saxons continued to interact and influence each other, and many Vikings eventually assimilated into Anglo-Saxon society, adopting Christianity and integrating into the local culture. By the early 11th century, Viking power in England began to decline. The Kingdom of York was defeated by the Anglo-Saxon king Ethelred the Unready, and the last Viking king of England, Harthacnut, died in 1042. The final blow to Viking influence came in 1066 with the Norman conquest. While the Normans themselves were originally of Viking descent, by the time of the conquest, they had largely assimilated into French culture and had little in common with the earlier Viking settlers in England. The legacy of the Vikings in England, however, lived on. The Danelaw may have fallen, but many of the cultural, linguistic, and legal contributions of the Vikings remain deeply ingrained in English society. The Vikings may have been brutal raiders, but they were also pioneers, bringing with them new ideas, technologies, and governance structures that helped shape the England we know today. The question of whether the Vikings were pillagers or pioneers depends on the lens through which we view their impact on England. On the one hand, their raids were violent, disruptive, and often destructive. They left behind a trail of bloodshed and fear, particularly in the early years of their invasions. But on the other hand, the Vikings were not just mindless raiders. They were also settlers, traders, and rulers, and their influence in England is seen in the language we speak, the laws we follow, and the cultural practices we uphold. The Vikings were both pillagers and pioneers, and their impact on England was profound. They were a complex people, driven by a variety of factors, including the need for resources, land, and power. They brought with them new ideas and technologies that helped shape the course of English history. The Vikings may have started as raiders, but they ended up as influential players in the creation of medieval England, leaving a lasting legacy that is still felt today. In conclusion, the Vikings were far more than just pillagers. They were pioneers, bringing with them a wealth of knowledge, technology, and culture that helped shape the development of England. Their legacy lives on in the language we speak, the legal systems we follow, and the technologies we use. While their raids were brutal, their influence was far-reaching and lasting. The Vikings may have been fierce warriors, but they were also skilled settlers, traders, and innovators. In the end, their role in England's history is one of both destruction and creation, of pillaging and pioneering.